It all starts with a routine security check at the courthouse, just another ordinary day. A black man walks in, calm, composed, carrying himself with quiet strength. But one arrogant cop decides today's the day he shows who's in charge. He thinks he can intimidate him, humiliate him, make him feel small. But what he doesn't know is he's just made the biggest mistake of his career. Because this man is not who he thinks he is. And by the time the truth comes out, the damage will be irreversible. Secrets will be exposed, careers will be destroyed, and a twist so shocking will leave everyone speechless. Stay with us, because you won't believe how deep the corruption runs. And before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, drop a comment below, and join the conversation. The brisk autumn air swept across Dallas, carrying with it a chill that hinted at the colder months ahead. The Dallas Municipal Courthouse loomed in the heart of the city like a fortress of steel and glass, a monument to justice with its towering columns and immaculate marble floors that echoed every purposeful step. Inside, the usual chaos of a Monday morning had settled into a tense hum. Attorneys barked orders to paralegals. Reporters jostled for position near the steps. Security guards eyed the crowd with an anxious vigilance. It was a big day. A high-profile corruption trial was about to begin, and everyone knew the man presiding over it was none other than Judge Gabriel Anderson. Anderson was a name whispered with both reverence and resentment throughout the legal community. Reverence for his unyielding integrity and brilliance in the courtroom. Resentment from those who found themselves on the wrong side of his rulings, those who thought their wealth or influence might somehow sway his decisions. Judge Anderson strode through the courthouse doors, his gait steady and resolute. He was a tall black man in his mid-50s, with a dignified presence sharpened by decades of battling injustice from both sides of the bench. His neatly trimmed salt and pepper beard framed a face marked by years of intensity and calm in equal measure. Today, he wore a crisp navy suit beneath his black judicial robe, his briefcase held firmly in his left hand. Anderson's eyes flicked over the bustling lobby, noting the reporters gathering like vultures. He moved with purpose, navigating the sea of faces and flashing cameras. He offered no sound bites, no comments. His focus remained locked on the task ahead. As he approached the main security checkpoint, his gaze settled on the metal detectors and the small crowd of officers clustered around them. Most were familiar faces, courthouse regulars who nodded at him respectfully, aware of the man's reputation and the authority he wielded. But there was a new face today. Standing just beyond the metal detectors was Officer Brad Carson. Stocky, red-faced, with a thick neck straining against the collar of his uniform. Carson had the kind of permanent scowl that seemed etched into his features from years of bitterness and brute force policing. He watched Anderson's approach with narrowed eyes, his gaze cold and calculating. Anderson could feel the man's stare like a physical weight, but he kept his composure, offering a polite nod as he approached the checkpoint. "Morning, gentlemen," Anderson said evenly. A few of the regular officers greeted him back with cordial nods, but Carson remained silent, his gaze locked on Anderson like a predator eyeing prey. "ID and bag, sir," Carson said, his voice gruff and clipped. Anderson handed over his courthouse ID and placed his briefcase on the conveyor belt. He'd been through this routine 100 times before. It was nothing unusual. But the way Carson scrutinized his ID was different. The officer held the badge longer than necessary, turning it over in his hand like he expected to find something incriminating hidden in the lamination. His lips curled into a smirk as he read the name aloud. "Judge Gabriel Anderson." He drawled out the words with a mocking undertone. "Big case today, huh? Seems like you're making quite the name for yourself." Anderson's eyes narrowed slightly. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered hostility in his line of work. Being a black judge in a predominantly white system came with its own unique set of challenges. But something about Carson's tone set his nerves on edge. "Just another day at the office," Anderson replied calmly, refusing to rise to the bait. Carson's smirk deepened, his gaze darting to the other officers, who were now watching the exchange with a mix of curiosity and unease. "Standard procedure," Carson said with an exaggerated sigh. "Step aside for a secondary check." Anderson raised an eyebrow. "Secondary check? My credentials are right there." Just following protocol, Carson shot back, his words sharpened by something that felt far more personal than mere bureaucracy. Anderson glanced around. The other officers avoided his gaze, their expressions betraying discomfort. Carson was clearly pushing boundaries, but none of them seemed willing to intervene. "Is this protocol specific to me, Officer Carson, or is everyone being screened twice today?" Anderson's voice was calm, but edged with steel. Carson's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before his glare hardened. "Are you questioning security measures, Judge? Because that doesn't seem wise. Not in a courthouse like this." Anderson studied him for a moment, weighing his words carefully. "I'm questioning the consistency of those measures. I walked through yesterday without issue. So, what's changed?" "Maybe you didn't catch the memo." Carson's voice dropped to a low, taunting rumble. "Heightened security. Got to make sure everyone's playing by the rules." Anderson's patience thinned. This wasn't about security. It was about control, authority being flexed in the most petty, blatant way possible. But he knew better than to escalate. The eyes of the courthouse were on him, and Carson was clearly enjoying the attention. This was a test, and Anderson had no intention of giving the man the satisfaction of rattling him. He stepped aside, moving to the designated area Carson had indicated. The officer approached with a handheld scanner, his movements slow and deliberate, each pass of the device feeling more like a power play than a genuine security measure. "Clear," Carson finally announced, his tone devoid of anything resembling professionalism. Anderson reached for his briefcase, but Carson held up a hand, his smirk returning. "Not so fast. Bags search. Standard protocol." Anderson's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "If you're going to proceed, Officer Carson, let's make this official." He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped the screen. A faint chime sounded, indicating the recording had begun. "Is there a problem, officer?" Anderson asked, his voice calm but edged with warning. Carson's smirk faded, his jaw clenched as he realized what was happening. The shift in power was immediate and undeniable. The other officers exchanged nervous glances. The air was thick with tension. The game had just changed, and everyone in that lobby knew it. The cold glow of the phone's screen reflected in Carson's eyes, his smirk melting away like ice beneath a heat lamp. The sudden shift in power hung heavy in the air, its weight pressing down on everyone nearby. Anderson's calm, unwavering gaze only deepened Carson's scowl. But for the first time, the officer looked uncertain. "Recording me?" Carson scoffed, though the crack in his voice betrayed his unease. "Think that's supposed to scare me?" "It's not about intimidation," Anderson replied smoothly, his voice steady and measured. "It's about accountability. If you're enforcing protocol as you claim, then this should be no problem." A few of the other officers exchanged uneasy glances. They weren't rookies. They understood exactly what Anderson was doing, and they understood what it meant if Carson pushed too far. For a moment, the only sounds were the faint hum of the metal detectors and the distant murmur of the courthouse lobby. Then Carson barked out a laugh. It was forced, sharp, the kind meant to cover up a sense of panic. "All right, fine," Carson snapped, his fingers twitching at his side. "You want to play it that way? Let's do this by the book." He jerked his thumb toward a small table near the security checkpoint, the sort of area meant for emptying pockets and checking briefcases, not for someone of Anderson's stature. But Anderson moved there anyway, his expression giving nothing away. "Put the briefcase down," Carson ordered, "and open it, slowly." Anderson complied, placing the briefcase on the table with deliberate care. He unlatched the clasps and opened it, revealing stacks of neatly organized legal documents, a tablet, a pen case, and various other materials essential for the morning's proceedings. Go ahead, officer, Anderson said, his phone still recording. Proceed. Carson's lips thinned. He stepped forward, his hands rough and clumsy as he began rifling through the papers. The gesture was careless, disrespectful. Sheets were crumpled and pushed aside with blatant disregard. Anderson's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his phone's camera locked on Carson's every move. "Busy day, huh?" Carson muttered, his tone laced with mockery. "Gonna put some rich scumbag behind bars and make yourself look like a hero?" "I simply do my job, Officer Carson," Anderson replied coolly. "Perhaps you should focus on doing yours." The jab struck its mark. Carson's eyes narrowed as he picked up Anderson's tablet, flipping it over and tapping the screen with far more force than necessary. The device powered on, its password prompt glowing softly. "What's on here?" Carson demanded. "Legal documents. Private files related to today's trial. Unless you have a warrant, officer, the first suggests you leave that alone." Carson's fingers twitched again, his grip tightening around the tablet. His eyes flicked to the phone Anderson held. There was something in his gaze now, something mean and petulant, like a child denied his favorite toy. "Let's see the bag itself," Carson said, his voice tight. Anderson handed it over, his fingers grazing Carson's for the briefest of moments. It was enough to feel the tremor of frustration pulsing through the officer's hand. Carson upended the bag, dumping its contents onto the table without care. Pens scattered across the surface. Loose papers fluttered down like fallen leaves. A couple of officers nearby exchanged uneasy looks, but none dared interfere. "That really necessary, officer?" Anderson asked, his voice sharper now. "Standard procedure," Carson replied with a shrug that was anything but casual. Anderson didn't miss the glance Carson shot toward his fellow officers. The look of expectation, as if he expected them to back him up, but they remained silent, their eyes cast downward, their expressions tight. It was clear that Carson was used to commanding the scene, used to having his word be the final say. But this time, he was losing control, and the knowledge of that loss only seemed to make him angrier. "You think you can just come in here and start throwing your weight around?" Carson sneered, shoving the bag back across the table. "You think that robe makes you untouchable?" "No," Anderson replied, his tone cool and controlled. "I think my position requires me to set an example. To uphold the law fairly and consistently. Something you seem to be struggling with, officer." Carson's face reddened, the veins in his neck pulsing. It was as if the man had been waiting for an excuse to unleash his resentment, to lash out at someone he believed beneath him. But Anderson was anything but, and that realization seemed to drive Carson further into a blind, simmering rage. "Yeah? You want to lecture me about doing my job? About following rules?" Carson growled, stepping closer, his chest puffed out like a rooster trying to appear larger than it really was. "Well, guess what? Out here, I make the rules. You don't run this place. I do." The declaration was so absurd, so saturated with the delusions of a small man wielding borrowed power, that Anderson almost laughed. But he kept his composure, his gaze unwavering. "Is that so?" Anderson replied. "And when your superiors see this footage, will they agree?" The question seemed to hit Carson like a slap. His bravado wavered, but only for a moment. Then his eyes hardened, his fists clenched. "You think you can intimidate me with that phone?" Carson snapped, his voice rising. "You think anyone's gonna take your word over mine?" Anderson met his gaze evenly. "It's not just my word, Officer Carson. It's your actions. And they're all right here." He gestured to his phone, the recording still rolling. A couple of the officers glanced away, clearly uneasy with the confrontation that was spiraling out of control. But Carson seemed beyond reason now. The flush in his cheeks deepened, his eyes gleaming with a sick kind of determination. "Hand over the phone," Carson growled, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. Anderson didn't flinch. No, the single word hung in the air like a challenge, daring Carson to cross a line he couldn't uncross. And Carson, in his fury and desperation, looked ready to do just that. Anderson didn't flinch. His eyes remained locked on Carson's, his phone still recording, the little red light a beacon of accountability. Carson clearly wished he could extinguish, but power meant control, and right now Carson was losing both. His shoulders stiffened, his posture rigid with the kind of fury that bordered on desperation. Hand over. The phone, Carson repeated, his voice trembling with a blend of anger and panic. It was like watching a cornered animal, all aggression masking something much more fragile. No, Anderson replied, his voice steady, each word sharp enough to cut glass. And unless you want this situation to escalate even further, I suggest you take a step back and reassess what you're doing. Carson's expression twisted, his lips curling into something between a snarl and a sneer. The other officers stood back, their silence a testament to their fear or indifference. Anderson couldn't tell which. But it was clear they weren't about to intervene. Not against one of their own. Think you're pretty damn clever, don't you? Carson shot back, his eyes darting between Anderson and the phone like a man drowning, grasping for control. What's the matter? Can't handle a routine search? What's the big deal if you got nothing to hide? Anderson's fingers tightened around the phone. What's at stake here isn't my privacy, Officer Carson. It's the integrity of your conduct. And from where I'm standing, it looks like you've already crossed the line. Crossed the line? Carson repeated, laughing, but it was a hollow, fractured sound. You're the one making a damn spectacle of yourself. You think flashing that little badge makes you special. You think it means you're untouchable? Anderson remained silent, his calm expression only seeming to infuriate Carson more. He could see it now, how the man's rage was spiraling, how each moment he failed to gain control only deepened his need to exert it. Here's how this is gonna go, Carson said, his voice low and dangerous. You're gonna turn that phone off. You're gonna hand it over to me. And if you don't, I'm gonna confiscate it as evidence of interfering with an officer's duties. Anderson arched an eyebrow. Interfering? I'm merely documenting your actions. That's not interference. That's ensuring accountability. Carson stepped closer, his bulk looming over Anderson like a thundercloud. I said, hand it over. I heard you, Anderson replied, and my answer remains the same. No. Behind Carson, some of the other officers shifted uncomfortably. Anderson could see their hesitation, the way their eyes flicked toward him and then quickly away, as if simply acknowledging what was happening made them complicit. But none of them stepped forward. None of them spoke up. You think this is some kind of joke? Carson hissed, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. You think you can just walk in here and disrespect me? Disrespect my authority? No, Officer Carson. I think you're the one disrespecting your own authority, Anderson said calmly. And right now, you're proving it to everyone watching. A few heads turned. Some of the courthouse staff had begun to gather at a distance, their murmurs growing louder, their phones raised like spectators at some kind of twisted gladiatorial arena. Carson's gaze darted around, his nostrils flaring as he took in the onlookers. It was clear he had expected this to be a private humiliation, a display of power with no consequences. But now his actions were being broadcast, documented, judged. Shut that off, Carson snapped, his voice hoarse with frustration. I'm not gonna ask again. Good, Anderson replied, his gaze unwavering. Because my answer won't change. The two men stared each other down, a clash of wills so intense. It seemed to electrify the air around them. Anderson's pulse was steady, his breathing calm. Years in the courtroom had taught him how to keep his composure under pressure. But even now, he could feel the danger lurking just beneath the surface. He saw the twitch of Carson's hand, the way his fingers hovered near his belt, as if the officer were debating whether or not to escalate the situation to something physical. Anderson's eyes flicked to Carson's hand, then back to his face. Be very careful, Officer Carson, Anderson said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Because whatever you do next will define not only your career, but your character. And right now, You're making a very public spectacle of your own failure to handle a simple interaction with dignity and respect." Carson's eyes widened, his pupils dilating with something that looked disturbingly like panic, the kind of fear that drives a man to lash out, to destroy whatever stands in his way. But then something shifted. A murmur rippled through the crowd, followed by the sound of boots thudding against the polished floor. Anderson didn't break eye contact with Carson, but he could feel the presence approaching. "Officer Carson," a stern voice cut through the tension like a blade. "What the hell is going on here?" Both men turned to see Captain David Torres striding toward them, a tall, solid man in his late 40s with dark hair streaked with silver and eyes that missed nothing. Torres was known throughout the courthouse as a man of strict professionalism and rigid adherence to protocol. He stopped a few feet away from Carson, his gaze flicking between the officer and Anderson, his brow furrowing. "I received multiple complaints from staff and visitors about some kind of disturbance," Torres continued, his tone clipped. "And now I arrive to find you accosting a sitting judge in the middle of the damn lobby? Care to explain yourself, Carson?" Carson's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His eyes darted to Anderson's phone, the recording still rolling, and then back to Torres. "Just carrying out standard security procedures, sir," Carson stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of Torres's scrutiny. I thought it was necessary to conduct a secondary screening. Protocol, you know? Protocol," Torres repeated, his eyes narrowing. "Is that what you call this? Harassing a judge with no valid reason other than your own petty grievances?" "It was just a precaution," Carson insisted, though his voice had lost all its previous bluster. "You know how it is, sir. High-profile trial, heightened security." Torres's gaze sharpened, his expression turning from skepticism to open anger. "Don't insult my intelligence, Carson. This isn't heightened security. This is harassment. And if you think you can hide behind your badge to justify it, you're sorely mistaken." The crowd murmured louder now, their voices a rumble of judgment and disdain, and for the first time, Carson looked genuinely afraid. Torres's words sliced through the tension like a knife, each syllable punctuated with the weight of authority. The murmurs of the crowd swelled, phones held aloft to capture every moment of Carson's unraveling. Anderson kept his phone recording, his eyes fixed on Carson's pale face as the man struggled to regain his composure. "Captain Torres, I was just trying to do my job," Carson sputtered, his voice cracking as his gaze darted between Torres and Anderson. "Security's tight today, you know, with the big trial and all. Just following protocol." "Protocol?" Torres echoed, his brow furrowed with disbelief. "You call dumping a judge's belongings across a table and threatening to confiscate his phone protocol? You think harassing a man of his standing, of any standing, for that matter, is part of your duties?" Carson's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The bluster and bravado he'd displayed just moments before had been replaced by something closer to desperation. Anderson remained silent, his phone angled slightly to capture both Carson and Torres. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, their curiosity and judgment mingling into a collective anticipation. Everyone wanted to see how this confrontation would end. "Sir, one was just." Being thorough, Carson finally stammered, making sure everything was secure. "High-profile case like this, you can't be too careful." Torres's gaze hardened. "You want to talk about being careful, Carson? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're dangerously close to making the worst mistake of your career." Carson swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing like a trapped insect. "I didn't mean any disrespect, Captain." "No? Because that's not what it looks like," Torres shot back. "What it looks like is a blatant abuse of authority. An attempt to humiliate a man who has done nothing wrong, simply because you could, because you wanted to make some kind of twisted point." "I was doing my job," Carson insisted, but the words came out weak, hollow. "Your job," Torres repeated, shaking his head. "Your job is to provide security, not to harass courthouse officials, not to single out someone based on your own personal biases." The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of Carson's mounting failure. Anderson could see the fear flickering in the officer's eyes, the way his shoulders slumped under the crushing pressure of Torres's scrutiny. But something about Carson's desperation made Anderson uneasy. This wasn't just about a power struggle. It was something deeper, something darker. "Captain Torres," Anderson said, his voice steady, drawing the man's attention. "I appreciate your intervention, but I think it's important to establish exactly what transpired here." Torres nodded, his expression unreadable. "Agreed, and I intend to get to the bottom of it." "Sir, 1. Carson tried again, his hands trembling slightly. "I was just doing my job, trying to ensure safety. The judge came in acting like he owned the place, recording me like I was some kind of criminal." Anderson arched an eyebrow. "You demanded my phone. You insisted I submit to a second screening without justification. And when I questioned your actions, you attempted to escalate the situation further. This is all on record, Officer Carson. Both my recording and those of everyone else present." Carson's gaze flicked around the lobby, his eyes widening as he took in the sea of phones aimed directly at him. His breathing quickened, his cheeks flushing a deep, angry red. "You were provoking me," Carson snapped, his voice rising. "Trying to make me look bad?" "No," Anderson replied calmly. "You managed that all on your own." Torres's lips tightened into a grim line. "Carson, the first suggest you stop talking before you dig yourself in any deeper. We're going to address this properly, through official channels. But right now, you're making a fool of yourself and damaging the reputation of this department." "Official channels?" Carson echoed, his eyes darting between Torres and Anderson like a trapped animal. "You mean internal affairs?" "That's exactly what I mean," Torres said sharply. "I'm going to file a report, and we're going to conduct a full investigation into your conduct." The color drained from Carson's face. "You can't be serious. I was just doing my job, trying to maintain order, trying to abuse your authority," Torres interrupted. "And now you're facing the consequences of that choice." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their collective disapproval a palpable force pressing down on Carson. His breathing quickened, his eyes wild and unfocused. "You think you can just ruin my career?" Carson snapped, his voice cracking with panic. "Because of one little misunderstanding? Because some judge decides to act like he's above the rules?" Anderson's eyes narrowed. "This was never about being above the rules. It was about you twisting them to suit your own agenda. And now you're lashing out because you've been caught." Carson's fists clenched, his entire body trembling with rage and fear. But before he could speak again, Torres cut him off. "Enough," Torres barked, his voice booming through the lobby. "I want you to leave the premises, Carson. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending a full investigation. Do you understand me?" The words hit Carson like a physical blow. He staggered back, his eyes wide with shock. "Suspended?" he echoed, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You're suspending me? Over this?" "Over your conduct," Torres replied coldly. "And believe me, if the investigation confirms what I suspect, you'll be facing far worse than just a suspension." Carson's face contorted, his jaw working furiously as if searching for anything that might salvage his crumbling authority. But there was nothing left, just the cold, brutal reality of his actions laid bare for all to see. The officer's shoulders sagged, the fight draining from him in a single deflated breath. Without another word, he turned on his heel and stumbled away, his boots echoing against the marble floor like the retreat of a broken man. As Carson disappeared from view, Torres turned back to Anderson, his expression cautious but respectful. "Judge Anderson, I'd like to speak with you privately," Torres said, "about what just happened and how we proceed from here." Anderson nodded, his gaze lingering on the spot where Carson had stood, the echoes of the confrontation still vibrating through the air. "Of course, Captain Torres," he replied. "Lead the way." Torres led Anderson down a series of sterile, brightly lit corridors, his steps measured and precise. The distant echoes of the lobby gradually faded away, replaced by the steady hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional murmur from passing courthouse staff. As they moved deeper into the administrative wing, the clamor of the public seemed like a distant memory. But the tension lingered, unshaken and stubborn. They entered a small, sparsely furnished conference room. A rectangular table dominated the center, its dark surface polished to a mirror-like shine. Torres gestured for Anderson to take a seat, his expression unreadable as he closed the door behind them. The latch clicked softly, sealing them away from the world outside. Anderson settled into a chair, placing his phone on the table, the screen dark but the recording still active. Torres noticed, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You're still recording?" Torres asked, his voice calm but carrying a note of curiosity. "I am," Anderson replied evenly. "Given the circumstances, I think it's best for everyone if we have a thorough record of what's discussed here." Torres nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving Anderson's face. "I understand. And I can appreciate your caution, Judge Anderson. What happened out there was unacceptable." "Agreed," Anderson said. "But what concerns me most is how far it was allowed to go before anyone stepped in." Torres's expression tightened, a flicker of something like shame crossing his features. "Carson's behavior was completely out of line. I should have been alerted sooner, but when I arrived and saw what was happening, it was clear to me he was trying to assert his authority in a way that went beyond protocol." "Assert his authority," Anderson repeated, his voice laced with skepticism. "More like abuse it. He was trying to humiliate me, to assert his dominance over someone he perceived as a threat to his ego." Torres nodded. "You're not wrong, and I won't make excuses for him. Carson's record has been problematic for some time now. But until today, he's managed to avoid any real consequences." Anderson leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "Avoided consequences? Because of his connections?" "In part," Torres admitted. "Carson's been with the department for over 20 years. He's built relationships, secured favors, and he's not shy about calling them in when it suits him." "And yet you suspended him," Anderson said, his tone thoughtful, "despite those connections." "Because it was the right thing to do," Torres replied, his voice firm. "And because what he did today crossed every line. I won't tolerate that kind of behavior under my watch. Not anymore." "Not anymore," Anderson echoed, his eyes narrowing. "So, you're saying this wasn't an isolated incident?" Torres hesitated, his fingers drumming against the edge of the table. "It's not the first complaint I've received about Carson, but it's the most blatant. He's always managed to skirt the rules, just enough to avoid formal reprimand. Verbal warnings, written notices. Nothing that's ever truly stuck, because no one had the courage to hold him accountable," Anderson said, "or because no one cared enough to try." "Maybe both," Torres admitted. "The truth is, Carson's part of a problem that runs deeper than just one officer. There's a culture of entitlement here, a belief that authority means immunity. And he's taken advantage of that culture for years." "And you've allowed it?" Anderson asked, his voice sharp. Torres's jaw tightened. "I haven't been in this position long, Judge Anderson. My predecessor was more lenient, preferred to keep things quiet rather than risk confrontation. But that's not my approach. I came here to clean house. And today was the first real test of that commitment." Anderson studied Torres's face, searching for cracks in the man's resolve. But all he saw was determination, frustration perhaps, but also a genuine desire to make things right. "So, what now?" Anderson asked. "You've suspended Carson, but if he's been a problem for this long, what's to say he won't come back and continue his behavior once the heat dies down?" Torres leaned forward, his gaze intent. "He won't be coming back. Not if I have anything to say about it. Suspension is temporary," Anderson pointed out. "It sounds like you're planning something more permanent." "I am," Torres replied. "But I can't just fire him outright, not without a thorough investigation. The union would tear me apart if I tried to push this through without due process. But I intend to see this through, to ensure he's held accountable for today, and for anything else that comes to light." "And you believe that will be enough?" Anderson asked, his tone skeptical. That an investigation will fix a culture of entitlement and abuse? No, Torres admitted, his shoulders slumping slightly. It's only a start, but it's a start I'm willing to make, and I'm hoping you'll be willing to help me. Anderson's eyebrows rose. Help you? How? By providing your statement, by sharing that recording, and by supporting my efforts to push for systemic change. Carson isn't the only problem. He's just the most visible symptom of a much larger disease. Anderson considered the man's words, his fingers tracing the edge of his phone. You're asking me to be a part of your crusade. I'm asking you to stand up for what's right, Torres corrected. To help me build a case strong enough to force real change. Carson needs to be dealt with, yes. But so do the people who've enabled him. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implication. Anderson knew the risks, knew the potential backlash from those who would rather see the problem swept under the rug than exposed to the harsh light of scrutiny. But he also knew the cost of doing nothing. I'll give you my statement, Anderson said finally, and I'll share the recording. But if you're serious about cleaning house, Captain Torres, you need to be prepared for the fight of your life. Torres's eyes gleamed with something close to relief. I've been preparing for this fight since the day I took this job, Judge Anderson. I just needed the right allies. Anderson nodded slowly. Then, let's get to work. The next morning, Gabriel Anderson woke before dawn, his mind already turning over the events of the previous day like stones in a riverbed. The confrontation with Carson, the unexpected ally he'd found in Captain Torres, the chilling realization of how deeply the problem ran. All of it blended together in his thoughts, sharpening his resolve and heightening his awareness of the battle he'd unwittingly stepped into. He sat at his kitchen table, sipping black coffee from a chipped ceramic mug, his gaze fixed on the skyline painted against the gray morning light. Dallas felt different today. Not just colder, but sharper, less forgiving. His phone buzzed, cutting through the silence. Anderson glanced at the screen, his brow creasing at the unfamiliar number. Judge Anderson speaking, he answered, his voice calm but wary. Judge Anderson, it's Captain Torres. I hope I'm not calling too early. Not at all, Captain. I take it you have news? I do, Torres replied, his tone tight, professional. But there was something else there, too. A trace of urgency. I've initiated the investigation into Carson. I wanted to let you know that I'll need your official statement by the end of the day. I expected as much, Anderson replied. I'll provide everything you need. Good. Because Carson's already made his move. The words dropped like stones into a still pond, sending ripples of unease across Anderson's mind. What do you mean? He's filed a counter-complaint against you, claims you interfered with his duties, attempted to incite a public disturbance, and threatened him with false accusations. Anderson felt a cold smile tug at the corner of his lips. I suppose I should have expected that. His lawyer's already barking up my tree, Torres continued, talking about harassment, racial bias ironic, considering the circumstances. Ironic? Yes. Surprising? No. He's trying to muddy the waters, make it look like this is some kind of personal vendetta instead of what it really is. Standard playbook for guys like him. So, what's the plan? Anderson asked, his voice steady. Document everything. Every conversation, every interaction. We need to build a case so airtight, his lawyer can't find a crack to exploit. I've already started pulling his records, going back years. It's worse than I thought, Judge Anderson. Way worse. Anderson felt his chest tighten. How bad? Multiple complaints of excessive force, harassment. Even a couple of cases where he allegedly coerced witnesses into providing false statements. Most of it got buried under bureaucracy, swept under the rug by people too scared or too comfortable to challenge him. And now, those same people are scrambling to cover their tracks. Carson's not just fighting for his career. He's fighting to protect everyone who enabled him, and they're not going to let him go down without a fight. Anderson's fingers drummed against the tabletop. So they're circling the wagons, trying to frame me as the aggressor. Exactly, Torres said. But they don't have the advantage they think they do. Not this time, because of the recordings. Because of the recordings, Torres confirmed. But more than that, because you're willing to speak up. Most of Carson's victims were too afraid to come forward, or they were silenced before their complaints could gain traction. You're different. They can't intimidate you, and they can't ignore you. Not without making themselves look even guiltier, Anderson said thoughtfully. Right. Which is why we need to act quickly. I'm pulling together everything I can. I've got internal affairs breathing down my neck, but that's a good thing. It means they're taking this seriously. But if we want to push this through, we need more than just your statement and that footage. We need witnesses, other officers willing to come forward. Anderson frowned. You think they will? I think some of them might, Torres replied. I've spoken to a few already. Younger guys mostly. The ones who don't have their careers tied to Carson's network of favors and threats. They're scared, but some of them are willing to talk. Willing to talk isn't the same as willing to testify, Anderson pointed out. No, but it's a start, and if we can build enough momentum, the others might follow. Anderson considered this, his mind clicking through the possibilities like pieces of a puzzle. And what about Carson himself? Is he cooperating with the investigation? About as well as you'd expect, Torres said dryly. He's denying everything, claiming he was only doing his duty, and that you escalated the situation to make him look bad. His lawyer's already framing this as a racially motivated attack on his character. Of course he is, Anderson said, his tone grim. When all else fails, play the victim. It's a strategy that's worked for him before, Torres admitted. But this time, he's overplayed his hand. Too many eyes are on him. Too many people saw what happened. But not everyone saw the truth, Anderson said. Not everyone understands the full extent of what Carson's been doing. And even if we expose him, that doesn't fix the system that allowed him to thrive. No, it doesn't, Torres agreed. But it's a start. And right now, I'll take any progress I can get. Anderson leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the window where the first streaks of sunlight were cutting through the clouds. You're fighting an uphill battle, Captain. And you're making enemies in the process. I've been making enemies my entire career, Judge Anderson. And frankly, I'd rather have them as enemies than as friends. Anderson allowed himself a faint smile, a sentiment I can respect. So, will you work with me? Torres asked, his voice steady and determined. Yes, Anderson replied without hesitation. You'll have my statement today, and I'll share the footage. But if you're serious about fixing this, Captain, you're going to need more than just me. I know, Torres said, and I'm already working on it. Their conversation ended with a promise. A fragile, tentative alliance built on the hope of something better. But Anderson knew it was only the beginning. The forces aligned against them were formidable, and the real fight was only just beginning. He ended the call and looked down at his phone, the screen still bright with the recording he'd made of Carson's breakdown. Proof of wrongdoing, but only a piece of the puzzle. With a sigh, Anderson set his coffee mug aside and rose to his feet. The day had barely begun, but the weight of it was already pressing down on him. He had work to do, and the clock was ticking. By midday, the courthouse was buzzing with an energy that felt both frenzied and calculated. News of Carson's suspension had already leaked to the media, and whispers of an impending investigation spread through the halls like wildfire. Gabriel Anderson walked with purpose, his presence commanding even more attention than usual. People greeted him with the usual mix of deference and curiosity, but today there was something else in their eyes, a glint of expectation. Everyone knew something big was happening, and everyone was waiting to see what the judge would do next. Anderson's chambers were a sanctuary of order and precision. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes of legal texts and landmark case files, each one meticulously arranged. His desk was similarly pristine, papers stacked neatly, his computer screen glowing softly with documents waiting for his attention. But Anderson's focus was elsewhere. He had spent the morning preparing his statement for Torres, ensuring that every detail was accurate, every observation clearly documented. He had reviewed the footage from his phone, replaying Carson's outbursts, analyzing the man's aggression and unraveling composure frame by frame. He knew it was strong evidence. But he also knew it wouldn't be enough. A knock at his door drew Anderson's attention. His assistant, Carla, stepped inside, her expression tight with worry. "Judge Anderson, there's someone here to see you," she said, her voice low. "Captain Torres." He said, "It's urgent." "Send him in," Anderson replied, his gaze sharpening. Carla nodded and stepped aside, allowing Torres to enter. The captain looked more strained than Anderson had ever seen him. His usually immaculate uniform was rumpled, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. "Captain," Anderson greeted, gesturing to the chair across from him. "I assume you have news." "You could say that," Torres replied, sinking into the seat. He ran a hand through his hair, his expression grim. "Carson's fighting back harder than I expected. And he's not doing it alone." Anderson folded his hands on the desk. "Explain." "Carson's lawyer is a bulldog," Torres said. "He's already filed a formal complaint against me, claiming I acted outside my authority by suspending Carson without a full investigation. And now he's pushing to have the footage you recorded thrown out on grounds of entrapment." "Entrapment?" Anderson repeated, a hint of disbelief coloring his tone. "They're arguing that you deliberately provoked Carson into overreacting so you could build a case against him," Torres explained. "It's a desperate move, but it's gaining traction. And that's not the worst of it." "What else?" Anderson asked, his voice calm but laced with suspicion. "Carson's allies are circling the wagons," Torres said. "Some of the higher-ups who've protected him all these years are pulling strings behind the scenes. They're calling in favors, trying to discredit both you and me. And how are they doing that? They're trying to paint this as a personal vendetta, claiming that you've been gunning for Carson for years because of some supposed slight he made against you. And they're saying, I'm only going along with it to advance my own career, to make a name for myself by taking down a bad apple," their words, not mine. Anderson's expression remained unreadable, but a cold fire had ignited behind his eyes. "So, they're playing the victim, turning the narrative on its head." "Exactly," Torres replied. "And they're doing it with the kind of resources and influence that can make things very difficult for both of us. Which means we need to move quickly," Anderson said. "You said you were gathering statements from other officers. How's that progressing?" "Slowly," Torres admitted, frustration clear in his voice. "Most of them are too scared to speak out. They've seen what happens to people who cross Carson or his allies. The ones who are willing to talk are mostly rookies, the guys who haven't been corrupted by the system yet. But even they're hesitant because they fear retribution," Anderson said, his tone thoughtful. "And they're right to be afraid. If this investigation collapses, Carson will come back with a vengeance. And he won't be satisfied with just his old position. He'll want to punish anyone who spoke against him," Torres agreed. "And the worst part is, his allies will back him up. They'll make sure he has the power to exact whatever revenge he wants." Anderson leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "We need more than just their statements. We need evidence. Hard, undeniable proof that Carson has been abusing his authority for years." "I've been digging through his records," Torres said. "Internal Affairs is finally taking this seriously, but their resources are stretched thin. And Carson's friends are doing everything they can to slow the process down." "But you have found something?" Anderson pressed. "Enough to justify the investigation," Torres replied. "But not enough to guarantee a conviction. Not yet. And with the pushback we're getting, I need something more concrete." Anderson nodded slowly. "Then we find it. Whatever it takes." "That's easier said than done," Torres said, his shoulders slumping. "But I'm not giving up. Not when we're this close." "I'm not giving up either," Anderson replied. "But we need to change our approach. If Carson's allies are trying to frame this as a personal vendetta, then we need to show them what it really is. A systemic problem. Torres's eyes narrowed. Go on. We need to expose the entire network protecting Carson, Anderson said. Not just the man himself. The people who've enabled him, shielded him from accountability. We need to turn the spotlight on them, make it impossible for them to hide. Torres considered this, his expression hardening. That's a tall order, Judge Anderson. We're talking about people with real power, connections that go way beyond the courthouse. I understand the risks, Anderson replied. But if we don't expose the rot at its roots, nothing will change. Carson will come back. And next time, he'll be even more dangerous. Torres nodded slowly. You're right. And if we're going to do this, we need to be smart. Strategic. Which means we need allies of our own, Anderson said. People willing to stand with us, even if it means risking their own careers. And you think those people exist? They have to, Anderson replied, his gaze steady. And if they don't, we'll find a way to make them. For a long moment, Torres said nothing. Then he reached across the desk, extending his hand. Anderson clasped it firmly, their grip solid and unwavering. All right, Torres said. Let's tear this whole damn thing down. The courtroom was buzzing with a tension that felt almost electric. Rows of spectators filled the benches, their eyes fixed on the front of the chamber where Gabriel Anderson sat, his face calm but alert. He had presided over countless trials in his career, but this one felt different. The stakes were higher, the opposition more cunning. It was a corruption trial, sprawling and complex, involving high-ranking officials accused of taking bribes to secure lucrative contracts, the kind of case that could topple careers and shatter reputations. But Anderson's focus was only partially on the proceedings at hand. His mind kept drifting to the war brewing outside the courtroom walls. Carson's allies had made their presence known. A flurry of counter-complaints and accusations had emerged over the past week, all of them aimed at discrediting Anderson's credibility and undermining Torres's investigation. The pressure was mounting. Torres had kept him updated with every development. The captain's frustration was palpable, his determination evident. But Anderson could sense the strain. Carson's network was vast, its reach extending into corners of the department that Torres hadn't even considered. As the defense attorney finished his opening remarks, Anderson forced himself to focus. He nodded, acknowledging the lawyer's closing words before glancing at the prosecutor. Mr. Daniels, you may proceed, Anderson said, his voice firm and steady. The prosecutor rose, his demeanor confident but cautious. The man was skilled, experienced, but even he seemed affected by the tension permeating the room. Anderson listened as the prosecutor began to outline the case, his arguments precise and methodical. But despite the man's professionalism, Anderson could sense the undercurrent of anxiety. Everyone knew what was happening beyond the courthouse doors. Everyone understood the implications of Carson's battle against accountability, a battle that had spilled into the courtroom itself. During a brief recess, Anderson retreated to his chambers, his mind racing. He checked his phone, half expecting another message from Torres. But instead, he found an email, anonymous with no subject line. Frowning, Anderson opened it. The message was brief, written in hurried, clumsy sentences. They're coming for you, Carson's people. They're going to twist everything, make you look like the villain. Be careful who you trust. No signature, no way to trace it. Just a warning from some unseen ally, or perhaps another attempt to rattle him. He considered forwarding the message to Torres but hesitated. They had agreed to be transparent with each other, but something about this felt off, deliberate, like someone was trying to push him into a mistake. Another knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Carla, her expression tight. Judge Anderson, there's someone here to see you. Says it's important. Who is it? Anderson asked, his tone guarded. He wouldn't give a name, Carla replied, her voice laced with unease. But he said he has information about Carson, and that you'd want to hear it. Anderson's eyes narrowed. Send him in. Carla hesitated before nodding and stepping aside. Moments later, a young man entered, his clothes rumpled, his eyes darting around the room like a hunted animal. Anderson recognized him immediately. Officer Mark Willis. A rookie, fresh out of the academy, with the kind of idealism that rarely survived long in a place like Dallas. "Judge Anderson," Willis said, his voice shaky but determined, "I'm sorry to bother you like this, but I didn't know who else to go to." Anderson gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down, Officer Willis, and tell me what's on your mind." Willis lowered himself into the seat, his shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. I heard what happened with Carson, and I know you're working with Captain Torres to take him down." "Go on," Anderson said, his gaze steady. "I've seen things," Willis continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Things Carson's done. Things he's gotten away with because of his connections. And I know there are others who feel the same way, who've seen the same things, but they're too scared to come forward." "And you're not?" Anderson asked, his tone neutral. Willis's eyes met his, a flicker of defiance shining through his fear. "I'm scared, Judge Anderson, but I'm more scared of what happens if nobody does anything. If Carson keeps getting away with this." Anderson leaned forward, his expression intent. "What do you have for me, Officer Willis?" "A list," Willis said, his hands trembling as he reached into his jacket pocket. "Names of officers who've complained about Carson. Some of them filed official reports. Others, they just told me, off the record. But it's something." He placed a folded piece of paper on the desk, his fingers shaking as he withdrew his hand. "And you're willing to testify?" Anderson asked. Willis hesitated. "If it comes to that, yes. But you have to understand, sir, Carson's got people everywhere. People who will ruin me if they find out I talk to you." "I understand the risk you're taking," Anderson said. "But if you're serious about making a difference, then you need to be prepared for whatever comes next." "I am," Willis replied, though his voice trembled. "But you need to be prepared, too. Because they're not just coming after me. They're coming after you, Judge Anderson. Hard." Anderson's gaze never wavered. "I know, and I'm ready." Willis rose to his feet, his expression a mixture of relief and terror. "I should go before someone sees me here." "Thank you, Officer Willis," Anderson said, his voice sincere. "You did the right thing." Willis nodded, his face pale as he turned and hurried out of the room. Anderson unfolded the piece of paper and scanned the names. There were a dozen of them. Officers who had witnessed Carson's abuses or been victimized themselves. Some of the names were familiar. Others were new, but all of them represented something vital, a crack in Carson's armor. Anderson reached for his phone and dialed Torres's number. The captain answered on the second ring, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Captain Torres, I have something you need to see." The fight was escalating, and Anderson intended to meet it head-on. Torres's office felt like a war room. Papers cluttered every available surface, files stacked precariously, their edges frayed from constant handling. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and tension, the kind that seeps into a place when battles are waged without sleep or mercy. Anderson sat across from Torres, his fingers tapping lightly against the table's edge. The list of names Officer Willis had given him lay between them, the creases in the paper deep and worn from Anderson's repeated handling. "Willis wasn't exaggerating," Torres said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Carson's network runs deep. Some of the names on this list, I've had my suspicions, but nothing concrete." "And now?" Anderson asked. "Now, we've got something, but it's not enough. We need more than just a list of complaints. We need testimonies, documented evidence, a solid case that even Carson's allies can't dismantle." Anderson nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "And what about the officers willing to testify? Have you reached out to them?" "Some of them," Torres replied. "A few are willing to talk, but most are terrified. Carson's reputation is legendary. The ones who aren't in his pocket are too scared to speak out. They've seen what happens to people who cross him." Anderson's expression tightened. "Then we need to make sure they understand they're not alone. that if they come forward, they'll be protected. Torres let out a harsh laugh. Protected? From who? From Carson? From his allies? From the entire damned department? From all of them, Anderson replied, his voice low and firm. This can't just be about Carson. It has to be about the system that's allowed him to thrive. You're talking about a complete overhaul, Torres said, his eyes narrowing. That kind of change doesn't come easy. And it sure as hell doesn't come without bloodshed. Maybe not, Anderson acknowledged. But if we don't try, nothing will change. And more officers like Willis will be left to fend for themselves. Torres ran a hand over his face, the lines of fatigue etched deeply into his skin. You're not wrong, but we're not just fighting Carson anymore. We're fighting everyone who's ever protected him. Everyone who's ever benefited from his abuses. And that's exactly why we have to push forward, Anderson said. If we let them silence us, then they win, and Carson becomes even more untouchable. Torres stared at him for a long moment, his eyes searching Anderson's face, as if trying to gauge the depth of his resolve. Damn it, Torres muttered. You're not going to back down, are you? No, Anderson replied, his gaze steady. And neither are you. Torres let out a tired chuckle, the sound brittle but genuine. No. I guess I'm not. They spent the next hour sifting through the names Willis had provided, cross-referencing them with previous complaints and reports that had somehow never made it past the initial review process. The pattern was disturbingly clear. Carson had been protected for years, shielded by supervisors, union representatives, even city officials who saw his aggressive tactics as a necessary evil, a way to maintain order in the parts of Dallas most preferred to ignore. Look at this, Torres said, jabbing a finger at a particularly thick file. This officer Harris. He filed a complaint against Carson 2 years ago, claimed Carson threatened him after Harris tried to intervene during an arrest where Carson used excessive force. What happened to the complaint? Anderson asked. Buried, Torres replied bitterly. Written off as a misunderstanding and swept under the rug. And Harris? He's been stuck on desk duty ever since. Carson made sure of that. Then we need to get Harris to testify, Anderson said. If he's been marginalized because of Carson's actions, he might be willing to come forward. That's assuming he's willing to take the risk, Torres countered. And even if he is, it's his word against Carson's. Unless we can back it up with something concrete. Anderson considered this, his mind racing. What about surveillance footage? Courthouse security logs? Anything that shows a pattern of misconduct? Already working on it, Torres said. But a lot of the footage has mysteriously gone missing. Files corrupted, tapes misplaced. It's like someone's been erasing his tracks all along. Someone has, Anderson replied. And they're still doing it. Torres's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. Speak of the devil, what is it? Anderson asked. Carson's lawyer just filed a motion to have the footage you recorded declared inadmissible. Claims it violates his client's privacy and was obtained under false pretenses. Anderson's jaw tightened. He was harassing me on public property in front of dozens of witnesses. That footage is perfectly admissible. Doesn't matter, Torres said, his frustration evident. They're throwing everything they can at us, trying to bog us down with legal maneuvering while they rally their allies. Then we can't afford to waste time, Anderson said. We need to move before they have a chance to regroup. Torres leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowed in thought. I'll reach out to the officers on this list. See if I can get more of them to testify. But you need to be ready, Anderson. Because when Carson realizes he's losing control, he's going to get desperate. I'm ready, Anderson replied. And I've faced worse than Carson before. Torres smiled grimly. Maybe. But Carson's got resources, connections. And now that he's feeling cornered, he's going to lash out. Hard. Let him, Anderson said. Because every move he makes only proves our point. Every act of desperation shows the world exactly who he is. Torres nodded slowly. You've got guts, Anderson. I'll give you that. Let's just hope you've got enough to see this through. I intend to, Anderson replied, his voice steady and sure. no matter what it takes. The battle lines were drawn, and as Anderson watched Torres gather the files, he knew the fight was only just beginning. The courthouse was a fortress that morning, its corridors crowded with attorneys, journalists, officers, and spectators who had gathered for what was quickly becoming the most anticipated hearing of the year. Gabriel Anderson sat in his chambers, his gaze steady as he reviewed the documents spread across his desk. But even as he read, his mind was racing, piecing together the threads of a tangled conspiracy that stretched far beyond Carson's malicious influence. Captain Torres had worked tirelessly over the past few days, chasing down leads, pulling records, and persuading frightened officers to come forward. Some of them had been willing to speak, their testimonies painting a picture of corruption and abuse that ran deep. Others had refused, their fear too great, or their loyalties too entrenched. But even with the mounting evidence, Anderson knew their case was still vulnerable. Carson's allies were powerful, their reach extending into every corner of the department. If the truth was to be brought to light, it would take more than just words and accusations. It would take undeniable proof. A sharp knock on the door pulled Anderson from his thoughts. Carla entered, her expression tight, and her eyes flickering with something between excitement and anxiety. "Judge Anderson," she said, her voice strained. "Captain Torres is here to see you. And he's not alone." Anderson's brow furrowed. "Send them in." Carla stepped aside and Torres strode into the room, his posture tense but his eyes gleaming with determination. Behind him was a man Anderson didn't recognize, a man whose presence seemed to carry its own weight. "Judge Anderson," Torres began, his voice low and urgent. "This is James Foster. He works in the IT department for the Dallas Police." Foster stepped forward, his gaze darting nervously around the room before settling on Anderson. He was a slight man, his hair thinning, and his glasses slipping down the bridge of his nose. But there was something fierce in his expression, something that suggested he had crossed a line he could never return from. "Mr. Foster," Anderson greeted, his tone calm and welcoming. "Please, have a seat." Foster hesitated before lowering himself into the chair, his hands trembling slightly. I don't have much time," Foster stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "If they find out I'm here, if Carson finds out, you're safe here," Anderson assured him. "And anything you share with us will be protected." Foster swallowed hard, his fingers twisting together. "I've been working in the department for almost a decade. I handle server maintenance, security systems, backups, all of it. And I've seen things I wasn't supposed to see." "What kinds of things?" Anderson prompted, his attention sharpening. "Deleted files," Foster said, his voice trembling. "Records that were supposed to be stored permanently. Complaints, footage from body cams, internal communications. Things that just disappeared. Or at least they were supposed to." Anderson exchanged a glance with Torres. "What do you mean, supposed to?" Foster's lips twitched into a faint, grim smile. "I'm not the only one who keeps backups. The official servers? Sure, those can be manipulated. Files deleted, overwritten, corrupted. But I keep my own copies. Off the grid, because I knew something wasn't right." "You have copies of deleted files?" Torres asked, his voice tight with hope. "Yes," Foster replied. "And not just from Carson. From his whole network, names, dates, reports that were altered or erased. It's all there. Proof that Carson's been protected for years by people far more powerful than him." Anderson felt a surge of adrenaline, his pulse quickening. "And you're willing to share this information?" Foster nodded, his expression haunted. "I have to. It's the right thing to do. But if they find out..." "They won't," Torres interjected. "We'll make sure of that." "You're doing the right thing, Foster. And we'll protect you." Foster looked between them, his gaze searching. "I hope so, because once this comes out, there's no going back." Anderson leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Foster's. "We're already past that point, Mr. Foster. Now, all that matters is seeing this through." Foster pulled a flash drive from his pocket, his hand shaking as he placed it on the desk. It's all here. Everything I managed to save. Enough to prove what Carson's been doing. Enough to prove who's been protecting him. Anderson picked up the drive, its weight feeling far heavier than it should. Thank you, Mr. Foster. This is more than I could have hoped for. Foster nodded, his shoulders slumping, as if a great burden had just been lifted. I just want it to be over. I want the truth to come out. It will, Torres promised. And when it does, they won't be able to hide anymore. Foster rose from his chair, his expression weary but resolved. I'll be in touch. But please, be careful. They won't go down without a fight. He left the room, his footsteps fading down the corridor like echoes of a desperate man's courage. Anderson and Torres exchanged a glance, the magnitude of what they had just been given settling over them like a shroud. This changes everything, Torres said, his voice thick with emotion. We can finally expose the whole damn operation. Not just Carson, but everyone who's been covering for him. Anderson nodded, his grip on the flash drive tightening. We need to move fast. Once they realize this evidence exists, they'll do everything in their power to destroy it. They won't get the chance, Torres vowed. Not this time. Anderson rose from his chair, his expression steeled with determination. Then let's finish this. They left the room together, their strides purposeful and united. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Anderson felt a glimmer of hope, because now they had the truth. And the truth was more powerful than any weapon Carson's allies could wield. The story you just heard isn't just about exposing corruption or holding a single bad officer accountable. It's about the power of integrity, courage, and persistence. Judge Gabriel Anderson and Captain Torres faced a system built to protect itself, a network of intimidation and deceit designed to silence anyone who dared to speak the truth. But they stood their ground. They didn't back down, even when the odds were stacked against them. For many of us, especially those who have lived long enough to see injustice and corruption masquerade as authority, this story is a reminder that real change doesn't happen overnight. It requires courage to stand up, even when you're standing alone. It takes resilience to keep fighting, even when your voice is drowned out by those who want you silenced. But the truth always matters. And speaking out, even when it feels impossible, can inspire others to do the same. This story isn't just about bringing a corrupt officer to justice. It's about the power of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when they refuse to be silenced. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own experiences, or if it inspired you to stand up for what's right, then don't let it end here. Share this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment to let us know your thoughts, because every voice matters, and together we can make sure the truth is heard. Thank you for watching. And remember, justice is only possible when we have the courage to demand it.